Former Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chretien has been receiving praise and inordinate media attention in recent days as asserting Canadian sovereignty in 2003 and announcing that Canada would not support the war in Iraq. Well, this is the commonly held view. Is it accurate? Is it possible Canada did in fact support the war more than most people, including many Canadians, realize? We'll hear a perspective from anti-war activist and researcher Richard Sanders that demonstrates Canada's clear complicity in that war. And, speaking of the Iraq War, on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of that conflict, with claims of weapons of mass destruction and other threats from the Iraqi regime long ago discredited, what has the outcome of the war been? Is the world safer? Are the Iraqi people better off? We'll hear an opinion from an authority on the subject, former UN humanitarian coordinator Hans von Sponeck. On today's program, Canada's secret war and Iraq 10 years after shock and awe. Bringing you the analysis beyond the media headlines, the Global Research News Hour is on the air. Welcome to the Global Research News Hour for the week of March 21st, 2013. I am series host and producer Michael Welch. The Global Research News Hour is a special radio collaboration between the Center for Research on Globalization and campus community radio station CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg. We seek to provide you with access to analysis of the major issues shaping our world today from thinkers, researchers, and unique political personalities rarely addressed by major media. Our program is available from the Center's website, globalresearch.ca. We can also now be heard on the Progressive Radio Network at prn.fm. We'll begin our show with some of the major stories shaping the national and international political landscape. The Eurozone may be facing a fresh crisis after the Cypriot government voted to reject a bailout deal Tuesday that would have seen 5.8 billion euros shaved off of savers' bank accounts. With the fiscal crisis escalating, banks have been shut since Friday, March 15th, and electronic transactions halted. Britain's RAF has been flying in 1 million euros in low-denomination notes for 3,000 service personnel, with the Minister of Defense explaining it as a contingency measure. Adding to the crisis was speculation that the finance minister, Michael Saris, resigned, but he refuted that by text. Russia has become close to the Mediterranean country after many Russian nationals flooded Cypriot bank accounts to take advantage of high interest rates and lax account vetting. Some reports suggest that the banking arm of the Russian energy company Gazprom may inject capital into Cyprus's second largest bank, Laiki, although Gazprom officials deny this. Former Finance Minister Mavros Mavrides raised the prospect of the country leaving the Eurozone as possibly the only way to avoid leaving the populace without money. That comes from the UK Guardian. On the first day of his visit to Israel, U.S. President Barack Obama assured Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that the United States would act if Syria used chemical weapons or transferred them to terrorist factions, and has committed to preventing Iran from attaining a nuclear weapon. Obama authorized an investigation into claims that Syria had recently used chemical weapons, even though he seemed doubtful of such claims. The American head of state also hopes to convince Israel to start peace talks with Palestinians, which came unraveled in 2010 after the Israeli PM balked at demands of halting the development of new settlements on occupied territories. This visit is Obama's first to America's main strategic ally in the Middle East. Obama was to have met with Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah on Thursday. That comes from Reuters. Both the Syrian government and the opposition rebels are calling for the UN to investigate a possible chemical gas attack in the Khan al-Assad region north of Aleppo. At least 25 people died and about 130 were injured when a rocket struck the area Tuesday. A local priest spoke of one of his parishioners, a doctor, treating victims who seemed to have trouble breathing and who seemed to manifest symptoms of a chemical gas attack. A local journalist, Abdullah Mawazini, explained that the strike happened in a region controlled by the government and that a military station has been under siege there for 3 weeks. He said the biggest concern since the beginning of the crisis was that the government's chemical weapons stockpile could get into the hands of extremist groups. An Israeli official indicated it was, quote, apparently clear, unquote, that chemical weapons had been used, but did not specify whether Assad forces or rebels were responsible. Mawazini also said that a video surfaced 2 months ago featuring a Syrian opposition group which claimed to be conducting experiments with chemical weapons. That comes from RT. On Monday evening, a power outage at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear facility disabled the plant's cooling systems for 4 spent fuel ponds for reactors 1, 3, and 4. Facility owner TEPCO confirmed the cooling systems resumed operation by Wednesday morning. TEPCO was still investigating the cause of the power failure, but according to spokesman Masayuki Ono, a faulty switchboard could have been to blame. Ono added this was the first time since December 2011 that an electrical failure affected so many facilities. The cooling ponds prevent the spent fuel from overheating and contains all the leaked radiation. If power to the cooling ponds had not been restored, the water could have boiled away, exposing the fuel rods to the air and allowing radiation to escape. It was March of 2011 that the plant was crippled by an earthquake and tsunami, causing meltdowns to 3 of the facility's 4 reactors. Engineers are expected to have years of work ahead of them stabilizing the disaster and tackling its effects. That comes from BBC News Asia. Al-Qaeda in Iraq has claimed responsibility for a series of car bombs, roadside explosions, and suicide bombings that swept across Baghdad and other Iraqi cities on the early hours of Tuesday, March 19th, and claimed the lives of about 60 people. These attacks mark the 10th anniversary of the U.S. coalition invasion of the country. Islamic State of Iraq, the country's al-Qaeda wing, has been energized in the wake of the Sunni Muslim rebellion next door in Syria and has carried out high-profile attacks since the start of 2013. Sunni Muslims in Iraq see the Shiite-led al-Maliki government as marginalizing them since the fall of Saddam Hussein and have protested for months west of Baghdad, blocking a highway to Jordan and Syria. Kurds in the north, meanwhile, have been frustrated by the central government's control over regional oil resources, which they seek to exploit and sell to Turkey. That comes from Reuters. March 19th marks the 10th anniversary of the day the U.S. military and its allies began the offensive against Iraq known as Operation Iraqi Freedom. The military campaign that ensued, coming on top of more than 10 years of sanctions, devastated the country and is estimated to have killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians, as well as thousands of coalition troops, including over 4,000 U.S. troops. Jean Chretien, Prime Minister at the time of the Iraq War, has received praise for keeping Canada out of the Iraq War. A closer examination, however, reveals that far from withdrawing from that conflict, Canada actively supported it. Ottawa-based Richard Sanders, coordinator of the Coalition Opposed to the Arms Trade, an anti-war group, has outlined in detail the ways in which Canada supported the Iraq War. He joins us now to explain his analysis. So, Canada did not become an official member of the Coalition of the Willing, but yet Canada did, according to your research, do quite a lot to support the war in Iraq. Could you maybe sort of list off some of the ways in which Canada was involved in that war?
Yeah, for sure, because we were very involved in many different ways. Okay, well, one of the ways that we were involved was through our Navy. You know, we often hear that we didn't have that many boots on the ground, didn't have that much of an Army participation, and that seems to be the one and only criteria by which many people in the mainstream media want to decide whether Canada was involved. How many Army people did we have on the ground? But Canadian participation through the Navy was quite significant. We had thousands of people aboard numerous multi-billion-dollar frigates and a destroyer that were involved in leading and protecting and supplying the coalition Navy in the initial invasion in 2003, as well as many times since over the years. We also did have Army generals, Canadian Army generals. There were 3 different Canadian generals who held command positions leading the entire war. They were deputy commanders, so number 2 in command of the Iraq War. There were 3 of them, and they each spent a year to a year and a half in Iraq. There was another Canadian general who led a U.S. Base where they trained thousands of U.S. soldiers and sent them off to war in Iraq. We provided war planners that helped to organize the strategy for the war before
the logistics?
It was started. We helped conduct the air war, so we had Canadian pilots and crew aboard these kinds of aircraft that sort of coordinated the air strikes. It's like air traffic controllers, except instead of being in a tower, they're in an aircraft, which is especially designed to coordinate all the different fighters and bombers. We provided airspace and refueling for U.S. Thousands of U.S. Planes that were going to and from Iraq over the years since the war started. So we basically let the U.S. fly over our airspace, land in our airports in Newfoundland, 2 of them, possibly 3, and then refuel there and then take off for the rest of the trip. We provided some air transport for the war. So we had C-130 aircraft with Canadian pilots flying U.S. troops and their weapons into and out of Iraq. By taking over in Afghanistan, which we did from the U.S., we helped free up U.S. troops. We did supply some ground troops, 3, 4, 5 dozen troops at least.
That was that part
on the ground.
Yeah.
So that's those are some of the ways, but there are quite a few other ways. Another way that I'll just quickly mention is through the Canadian arms trade. Canada sells $5 to $7.5 billion worth of military equipment per year, every year, and 75% of that goes to the United States. And in my research, I found that at least 40 different major U.S. weapon systems that were used in Iraq, all of the major warplanes, for example, used in Iraq, have very important Canadian components. So these warplanes, these fighters and bombers that conducted the air war and the airstrikes against Iraq, they would not have been able to do their missions if they didn't have the Canadian components in them. And there's quite a few other ways as well that we helped support by training Iraqi police, training Iraqi troops, providing radar sat data. So we have this billion-dollar satellite system above the Earth, and it provides data for targeting of U.S. weapon systems. We facilitate U.S. weapons training, testing in Canada. So they test their weapon systems that they used in Iraq. They tested them in Canada. So those are some of the ways that Canada was involved, and I think that pretty much proves that Canada was involved. I mean, it's really hard to deny it. I mean, there's so many different ways that we were involved. It's incredible that they can say that Canada was not involved or Canada sat out the war, or isn't it great? And we're asked to celebrate how Canada didn't get involved. Well, we did get involved. We were very involved, and I find it really incredibly just mind-blowing that they can pretend. They can put up this phony official narrative that says that we weren't involved when we were so deeply involved.
Yeah.
Very few other countries were as involved as Canada. I mean, obviously, the United States and Britain were more involved than we were. Australia had quite a few troops there, but they didn't provide all these other things that Canada provided.
Well, if you included all the various ways in which Canada did help, I mean, would we rank among the so-called coalition of the willing, or did we actually contribute more than some of the people who were listed as part of the coalition of the willing?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. We provided more than almost everyone in the whole world. I mean, other than the United States, Britain, and Australia, Canada provided, I think, a very good case could be made that Canada provided more than any other country in the world other than those three. So I'd say we were at least in the top five. Mm. Now, it's interesting, the whole issue of the coalition of the willing, because when that was announced on March 18th, 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell said, "We now have a coalition of the willing who have publicly said they could be included in such a listing." And then he said, quote, "There are 15 other nations who, for one reason or another, do not wish to be publicly named, but will be supporting the coalition," unquote. So in other words, the coalition of the willing is just a list of the countries that were participating in one way or another and were willing to publicly say that they were involved. And then he says very clearly there's 15 other countries who don't want to be publicly named, but they were supporting the coalition. So Canada is obviously in that group. They did not want to be publicly named as part of the coalition of the willing. So they were unwilling to be named as part of the coalition of the willing, but they were very willing to be involved.
Now, you mentioned a lot of various ways in which Canada was involved. You did mention a few dozen people who, like boots on the ground, there were actually Canadian soldiers there in Iraq, in a combat capacity. How was that possible when the official line was that we aren't sending soldiers to Iraq?
Okay, that's done through having these soldiers working under the command of British or American forces. So they're kind of on it. It's called an exchange. So they're on exchange. It's the same way that we had pilots flying U.S. warplanes during the war, flying, for example, these massive transport planes that drop tanks, that carry tanks in. They're C-17s. They're called Globemasters. And we had Canadian pilots that were flying during the Iraq War, part of the Iraq War, flying vast amounts of war materiel, weapon systems, including huge tanks, flying them right into battle zones. So they were Canadians flying U.S. warplanes. And that they do that by being on exchange. They're on exchange missions. So they were, and another thing is that these Canadian generals that were leading international forces of ground troops, they were on the ground. They weren't, a general is not the guy that's back kicking doors in and running in and kidnapping people and shooting people. But he's overseeing. We had 3 Canadian generals that took turns overseeing that. They had their boots on the ground. They were in Iraq. So that's another way that we had Canadian boots on the ground, Army guys. They were actual generals.
And these generals, I mean, like how many people would you say did they have oversight over?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't remember now. It's been a few years since I researched it. Many thousands. Let me see if I can very quickly find that. And I mean, these guys received medals for for what they did.
I believe that one of those generals became the head
Chief of Defense Staff, Walt Matinchik. Yeah. He led 35,000 U.S. troops in Iraq in 2004. He was there for over a year. About a year. So January 2004 to January 2005. And he was given a medal by the Canadian Governor General, Michel Jean, saying, I can quote to you from what it said, that the text that's associated with the medal, it says, Major General Matinchik led the Corps' 10 separate brigades consisting of more than 35,000 soldiers stationed throughout Iraq theater of operations. He also oversaw planning and execution of all Corps-level command support and combat service support operations. His pivotal role in the development of numerous plans and operations resulted in a tremendous contribution by the multinational corps to Operation Iraqi Freedom, that's what they called the Iraq War, and has brought great credit to the Canadian forces and to Canada. So this is a medal that he received for his leading role commanding more than 35,000 troops in Iraq. And then they have the gall to say that Canada wasn't involved in the war. I mean, it's ludicrous.
Yeah, if you
we're supposed to celebrate that Canada wasn't involved. All we're doing is celebrating that we've been deceived, that they've done a PR job, that there's been an incredible success in their propaganda, and that they've been able to successfully pull the wool over our eyes and deceive us and trick us in a psychological operation. Are we supposed to celebrate that? That's incredible.
Richard Sanders, I noticed that many of the ways in which Canada was, as you say, like supported the war, it was in terms of things like components and all these sort of connections that like seem to go right to the guts of the military. I'm wondering if it's even possible for Canada to stay out of any U.S. conflict, given the level of the tentacles between the Canadian and
right.
United States military-industrial complex.
Right. Well, in that one of the examples I mentioned was the Canadian military exports with the $5 billion a year or whatever to the U.S. That would be really hard to. I mean, obviously, we are so thoroughly integrated into the U.S. war machine that Canadian parts are right in there in all these major weapon systems. So if they called a war tomorrow, all of that stuff, that Canadian-made stuff, and these companies have received billions of dollars from the Canadian government to support their export industries. What could we do? Could we say, oh, we don't want you to fly those planes because they have all that weapons, that equipment in it? No, we couldn't. We couldn't withdraw our support from that. It's too late for that. So whatever war they happen to be fighting, Canada is playing its part. But there are other things, many of the other examples, training Iraqi police, training Iraqi troops. We set up the phony elections. Elections Canada, was a major player in setting up phony so-called democratic elections in Iraq. Providing radar sat data, sending in these exchange troops, they could be withdrawn. Sending in the generals, we didn't have to do that. Having our ships in the Persian Gulf, we didn't have to do that. We even had a Canadian Commodore who was leading the entire multinational fleet of warships that were escorting the U.S. Warships into place for the initial bombardment of Iraq. I mean, we didn't have to do that. We could have called those. We could have stopped all those things. Yeah, you can't stop the. Once you've sold them the equipment, you can't stop them from using it. But I mean, they could have stopped. If let's say we found out that Canadian companies were selling weapons to Syria, you don't think that they could stop it? Of course they could. But you're right. We are so thoroughly integrated into the U.S. war machine. It is very difficult to pull out.
So why is this meme so pervasive, this idea that Canada said no to the war in Iraq? Why is it that people continue to believe this in spite of all the documentation that you've put forward?
Well, all the research that I do and other people do don't mean anything compared to the mainstream media, right? I've got very little help from the mainstream media. The corporate media and also it fits into a huge mythology that we've had for decades. This whole myth of Canada, the great force for peace in the world. So it fits so nicely into that mythology that it was easy to sell this particular spin on that mythology because it fit in so nicely. So people will just go, yeah, that's right, of course, because Canada is not a war fighter. We're a peace-loving country, blah blah blah. So it's easy for the media to lie to us. The NDP was not much help. They were basically went along with the mythology. They did do some work to expose some of the ways that Canada was involved, but generally when the government said, okay, so we've decided not to be involved, even though they said, okay, we're not involved, then the NDP was bending over backwards to congratulate itself for having pressured the government to not be involved in the war. So then they got credit. They got support from their membership.
But, Richard, it seems to me even so-called progressive forces who are even instinctively suspicious of the mainstream media, they seem to buy into that message as well, don't you find?
Many do. Many people just haven't seen all the evidence. When you see it, it's really hard to ignore it. It's hard to not realize that we were involved when you see the list of all the things that we did. But somehow there are peace activists. I think there's an overlap with people who are big supporters of the International Criminal Court, big supporters of this so-called responsibility to protect, this new doctrine that the U.S. and NATO countries use as a pretext for going to war. It used to be called humanitarian intervention. And there's an overlap between these different mythologies or these different doctrines that are used to put a nice facade on war and participation in war. And so you have people in the peace movement who are willing to go along with these pretenses. You'd have to ask them how they managed to wrap their minds around these things, because it seems to me that the cognitive dissonance that these contradictions would create in your mind would be so strong that you wouldn't be able to keep such completely opposite ideas going in your mind at the same time. How can you believe that Canada wasn't involved and yet at the same time know that we did this and this and this and this and this and this to help the war? I mean, they're so completely contradictory that you would think it would cause some kind of discomfort in your mind, that you wouldn't be able to continue to believe those things. But somehow they managed to, or the whole responsibility to protect thing. How can they believe that the United States can lead a war to protect human rights? I mean, don't they know anything about the long history of U.S. wars? So you'd have to ask. It would be good for you to interview some people that and question them about that. How do they support these ideas like the responsibility to protect and the idea that Canada is a great, wonderful peacekeeping country when it is engaged in wars to the extent that it is.
Okay. Well, Richard Sanders, I want to thank you very much for, shedding some light there on why, on the reality of Canada's involvement in Iraq. And I guess if people want more information about your publication or your website, where would you direct them?
If you do a search for Coalition to Oppose the Arms Trade, then you'll find our website, the COAT website, and there's lots of detailed information there with references and footnotes and whatnot to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that Canada was very, very deeply involved in the Iraq War, not only during the initial invasion, but over the many years since.
Okay. Richard Sanders has been involved with the Coalition Opposed to the Arms Trade and publishes Press for Conversion magazine. Thank you very much for joining us, Richard.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
You're listening to the Global Research News Hour, broadcasting from CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg and from partnering radio stations across the country. We're also podcast at globalresearch.ca. We can also be heard on the Progressive Radio Network at prn.fm. It has been 10 years since the U.S. and its coalition partners launched a military offensive against the people of Iraq. The war resulted in the deaths of over 100,000 documented civilian deaths, according to Iraq body count, and much of the civilian infrastructure of the country has been devastated by the war. Now that Saddam Hussein has been removed from power and executed, and a new supposedly democratic government put in place, how are the Iraqi people faring? What are the current conditions? And what does the future hold? Hans von Spanek was the UN humanitarian coordinator for Iraq from 1998 to 2000 when he left in protest. He has an extensive understanding of Iraq's social infrastructure during the lead up to the 2003 war and beyond, and has been following the country's humanitarian situation since. He joins us from Germany, and he's recently authored an article, Iraq and the Betrayal of a People, Impunity Forever. So, Hans von Spanek, thank you very much for joining us on the Global Research News Hour.
Well, I'm glad to do that.
You became humanitarian coordinator during the period of the sanctions, toward just a few years before the official start of the war. Could you give us a bit of a read on just what the humanitarian situation was, before the 1991 war, and then during your time in Iraq in the 98 to 2000 period?
Well, of course, we can recall that before the 6th of August, when 1990 sanctions were pronounced on Iraq, Iraqi people, if they had a food problem, for example, it was one of obesity. They had ample food. It was a well-to-do nation. Despite low oil prices, they still had their coffers full with foreign exchange. They had a state-of-the-art medical system. They had among the best schools in the Middle East. They gave away many scholarships to non-Iraqis for young people from other Arab nations. So it was, by all counts, a country that was on the move. Even though it was headed by a dictator, but the dictator headed a secular country, a secular government, and gave ample space for development, gave good opportunities for women to participate in nation building. So despite all the negative aspects of a dictatorship, a brutal dictatorship at times, the country was in a fairly decent state. And then came the big mistake to move into Kuwait, a mistake made by Saddam Hussein, but carefully prodded, if you want. Details, we cannot have time for details, but prodded by the outside, particularly the United States, to enter into finding arrangements with the neighbor Kuwait at the terms of Iraq, and we know what happened from then onwards. The sanctions very quickly had a very strong grip on the Iraqi people. The caloric surplus that existed before sanctions very quickly became a very inadequate caloric intake by the people. Hunger developed, poverty was all pervasive, and this is often forgotten. For the first 5 years of sanctions in Iraq, the people of that country were totally dependent on handouts from voluntary contributions outside. There was no oil for food program. There was no humanitarian program financed by the United Nations. So it was a very, very difficult period for the Iraqis that accelerated the negative developments in the lives of the normal and innocent Iraqi population. And then in 1995, after, I would call it a ping-pong diplomacy between the Security Council and Saddam Hussein's government for various reasons, mainly because the government in Baghdad didn't want to have to subject itself to not only under force Operation Desert Storm 1991 to leave Kuwait, but also to suddenly goalpost changes that became apparent that were introduced by the Security Council to pay compensation, to be involved in disarmament, and also to account for missing Kuwaitis. These were the three reasons, and the government didn't want to accept that. So the victim, as so often in crises, were the people of Iraq. But after 5 years, it finally was decided to agree on an oil-for-food program, a so-called humanitarian exemption. Again, what is often not known in the public is that this so-called humanitarian exemption was entirely financed by the Iraqis themselves from the limited sale of oil that they were allowed to carry out under the sanction regime, and this was helpful. One cannot argue and say the oil for food program didn't help, but it was an inadequate help. Dictator Saddam Hussein could do within Iraq what he wanted under sanctions.
So you're saying that what you're painting a picture here is that the effect of the sanctions was to weaken the people's ability to resist Saddam Hussein, even if you acknowledge the need to somehow replace him.
Yeah. I mean, the formula didn't work.
Yeah.
The formula that was primarily introduced by what we call the P2 group, the two permanent members, the Security Council out of the five, the US and the UK, who had this idea that they could through this kind of economic pressure bring about political change. But as we now know, it wasn't at all so clear, certainly not when I served in Baghdad, but now it is totally clear. The oil for food program, the humanitarian exemption, wasn't meant to work. It awaited. Everything had to do with the fact that it was decided in Washington and in London. I think it's fair to say that nothing would change until Saddam Hussein and his government had disappeared. Okay. So you have milestones that support this contention. You have the goalpost changes in Security Council resolutions that made it more and more difficult for the Iraqis to meet international expectations. You had the October 1998 Iraq Liberation Act, which for once made it very clear what the official policy was. It was about regime change. And then you had, as of 1996, you had this inadequate oil for food program, which was kept alive as an inadequate instrument, and it was linked. That is important to also point out. It was linked, economic sanctions were linked to disarmament, and that was a very convenient way for the policymakers in the Security Council to ensure that things would not change until Saddam Hussein was gone.
Okay, so in 2003, we did see the launching of the shock and awe campaign, Operation Iraqi Freedom. So coming on top of this weakening of the Iraqi people, what kind of an impact did that end up having? What were the main social indicators that...
Well, you you see, again, very often the media and the public want to look at Iraq with a cutoff point of 19 March 2003, when this invasion, this illegal invasion, began. But one has to remember how the Iraqi people entered into this post-Saddam, post-sanction period. The national immune system was already totally weakened. There was a physical infrastructure that was broken. There was an education system that was in bad shape. There was a health system that was in worse shape. In the days when I served in Baghdad, it is an unbelievable statistic that I give you now, but it is a correct one. There was one single X-ray machine operating in the areas under the control of the government in Baghdad. Unbelievable. One single X-ray machine that was fully functioning. So when the 19th of March came, the people of Iraq entered this new phase in a very, very weak mental and physical state. And the hope, of course, was that things after the occupation had settled down and there were beginnings of a new political process with an Iraqi government to be formed, first an interim government, then an elected government, would be much better. But as it turned out, it wasn't any better. And yesterday, only yesterday, there was a BBC report from one of their reporters in Baghdad who concluded by interviewing Iraqi residents of Baghdad about their life, and they would, with one exception, they all were making the point that even during these inadequate days of sanctions, their lives were better. Sanitation facilities were terrible in my days, but they are terrible today. Electricity supply was not good. Today, it still is not good. Oil revenue, the amount of oil that Iraq is today managing to export is not much different from the days when sanctions prevailed. It's about 2.2, 2.3 million barrels per day. And added to all this, after the end of the sanctions and the beginning of the occupation, a new factor arose which isn't a typical part of a dictatorship, and that is the security factor. Suddenly, you had a very insecure environment in Iraq, which prevails today. The carnage continues. No one can predict the next day and the security of the next day. The housewife that goes to shop, or the man who takes the taxi to work, they have no idea where the next bomb is exploding. So the security factor is an additional element of misery for the Iraqi people. And the Iraqi people are waiting desperately for stability, and that stability hasn't come. Also, the relationship between the Arab side, the 15 governorates that are in the Arab area, and the 3 governorates that are in Iraqi Kurdistan, the relationship between the Kurdish leadership in the north and the Maliki government are not good. And the end product is that you have a social and economic reality today which is devastatingly bad.
You're citing the growth in sectarianism. That was there some sense in which Saddam Hussein, as tyrannical as he may have been, was able to somehow keep a lid on those varying factions?
He certainly. Let's keep in mind, Iraq was a secular, not an Islamic republic, and he did keep. That doesn't mean that during the days of Saddam Hussein that there were not a lot of problems, not very transparent, but there were Shia-Sunni problems. But there was a lid, as you say, there was a lid on this issue. And it was mainly a problem between the clergy in Karbala, in Najaf, and in Baghdad, the Shia clergy I'm talking about, and the government. But the rest, the Shia-Sunni idea wasn't an issue during my days. And today it is a very fundamental problem of intercommunal relations. So this certainly is one of the major new problems that have arisen. And it permeates every aspect of life, including education. I just heard a week ago that now there is an attempt to replace the teaching of art and sports by religion in many schools. The freedom to dress as you wish is not there. If you are a Sunni student and you have a Shia professor, then it's a much more complicated relationship than if you are a Sunni with a Sunni teacher or a Shia with a Shia teacher. It has gone down to this level which was unheard of during the years since 58, since Abdul Karim Qasem through a coup ended the monarchy in Iraq. So no one, wherever he or she stand on the political level, can argue that things today are better in Iraq than they were during these difficult days of sanctions.
And what about it's been expressed concern about depleted uranium and white phosphorus being used?
Well, these are, of course, again, issues like that are extremely important to consider. They're also very vulnerable to misuse and misinterpretation. And however, the sheer physical evidence of something that has gone wrong here because of the use of depleted uranium and the use of white phosphorus. Example, Fallujah. We have enough epidemiological evidence to show what is happening there. How many deformed children are born, how many cases of leukemia and cancer are becoming known. It's a continuation. I have myself seen, also after I left Iraq as an official, I traveled many times back to Iraq, and I did go to places like the Child and Mother Hospital in Basra. What you saw there, I had absolutely no idea was physically possible. What you could see in terms of deformed young babies and children, immense. And the cause of that, well, there is a scientific debate. Is it radiation? Is it depleted uranium? Whatever it is, it didn't exist before, and now it does exist, and we have the physical evidence. So it is an area of great concern to the World Health Organization that has, I must add here, been again and again under pressure not to go too deeply into the subject for the obvious reason that it would be an embarrassment to some governments who have used this kind of munition. So it's an important aspect in understanding the overall current situation in the country.
It does seem clear that you feel that the United States, the United Kingdom, should be held accountable for their for crimes against the peace and violations of the Geneva Conventions, among other breaches of international law. Are there any other entities that you feel need to be held to account for this disaster that's taken place?
Well, you know, I mean, you have a large number of people who had something to do in creating these conditions in contravention to United Nations Charter law, to the Geneva Convention, to the Hague Convention, to all the international law that was meant to prevent what we now see has happened. So the the number of people that should really be held accountable is very large. But you have to start somewhere. And as difficult as it is, as a former official, I'm not very pleased when I am accused of, being a hateful activist when I raise these issues about accountability. But I will, until we get to the point where we can say law, as every normal human being would concede, law is and justice is for everybody, not just for the losers, also for those who have won a military victory. They are as accountable as the others. And that motivates not just me, but many others, my friend and colleague, Dennis Halliday. You mentioned Professor Boyle. There are many others who simply want to insist that people who had something to do in senior positions cannot walk away freely. And this is why some of us, Dennis Halliday and I, are both members of the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Commission. Since 2005, we have tried very hard to get the evidence of violation put into on paper. We have interviewed witnesses from Abu Ghraib, from Bagram in Afghanistan, from Guantanamo, all victims of violation of international law, and we have in possession now 2 very valuable volumes of evidence of these courts in Kuala Lumpur that are courts of conscience. They are not normal national legal entities. So the effort now, we are now at a stage where we are trying to find, with the help of eminent international lawyers, I do not want to identify them at this stage, but we have people who are eminently qualified to carry this forward, from a Malaysian court of conscience to a national court, a normal legal court, and eventually I hope that the International Criminal Court will change its attitude towards the submission we have made, in which Dr. Mahathir, the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, has argued that the ICC should adopt these cases in order to bring justice to the perpetrators of the situation in Iraq.
You are also somewhat familiar with the way the Libyan operation carried out, and it does seem as if there are certain parallels there with Iraq, in the sense that you do have a leader that could be condemned for his own conduct toward his own people, but at the same time, you end up with a humanitarian disaster and a breach of international law. I mean, the Kuala war crimes. Yeah. Notwithstanding, is there any sense that that lessons are going to be learned as a result of this process, that we could prevent other countries from being overthrown?
Well, at the moment, there is an unwillingness in official quarters to learn lessons, and it's the public, it's the civilian conscience that reminds the officials that something needs to be done. The Libyan case is, in many ways, is quite comparable to Iraq, if for no other reason than, there were the days when the same dictator in Baghdad was a friend of the very powers that later on tried to topple him. The same in Tripoli. The Libyan Gaddafi was in the good books of many because it paid off. It was good business. So you overlooked all that which you should never have overlooked, and then ultimately you decided to topple that leader too. It's tragic. It's, to me, tragic that this R2P concept, which was, again, a Canadian initiative. You may remember 2001, August, it was the Canadian government that introduced this international commission to look at responsibility to protect issues. And what was created then by the UN in the Global Summit in 2005 as a follow-on to the Canadian initiative was something very valuable. But it made one big assumption. And the assumption was that it would be applied in a transparent and honest way. Well, in Libya, it wasn't. In Libya, the impression was it was applied, and the mandate given to the NATO was to apply this concept to protect people, to protect innocent civilians. But it didn't take long before even the French, the British, and the Americans and some others didn't shy away from admitting it wasn't about that really. It was about regime change. So when you have this kind of use of theoretically valuable concepts like the R2P applied with a very different motive, then don't be surprised if there are others who are not willing to follow you because they don't trust you. And this R2P concept could have, had it been applied honestly in the case of Libya, could have been a useful concept to apply in Syria. But as you have seen, there's a complete stalemate in the Security Council. The Russians and the Chinese, maybe also for some self-interest, but they certainly have a convincing argument when they say, no, we don't want this because we don't trust that this is really the way you want to handle it. You have other reasons why you want this. So we have, at the moment, a very, very poor preparedness by the United Nations to handle and play a constructive role in diffusing international crises.
Well, Hans von Spanek, I wanted to thank you very much for that rather comprehensive overview of the Iraq situation, especially 10 years after the war, and as well as following the sanctions that worsened things so much. So thank you very much for joining us on the Global Research News Hour.
Well, I wish I could say it was a pleasure. I think it was more a responsibility to make my contribution to what I perceive to be the actual conditions.
Okay. Hans von Spanek was the UN Humanitarian Coordinator for Iraq from 1998 to 2000, and he has written a recent article, Iraq and the Betrayal of a People, Impunity Forever. You've been listening to the Global Research News Hour. You can hear our programs every week on CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg and on partnering radio stations across the country. We are broadcast on the Progressive Radio Network at prn.fm. You can also download each episode from the website globalresearch.ca. To leave feedback on this program, email globalresearchnewshour@gmail.com. I am series host and producer Michael Welch. Join us again next week.